Imagine for a moment that you're walking along the docks of Lisbon in 1580. The scent of salt, spices, and wet wood fills your nostrils. Before you, towering like a floating cathedral, stands a Portuguese galleon, ready to set sail for the Indies. You watch the sailors load the final supplies, barrels of water, sacks of rock-hard biscuits, salted meat. Now tell me, do you honestly believe you would survive 3 months aboard that ship? Before you answer with confidence, let me share what I discovered while investigating the actual records of those voyages. What I found were not just tales of adventure and discovery, but documents that reveal a reality so brutal it would make any modern person question whether humanity has really advanced at all. You are not welcome aboard. Let's start with the obvious, and perhaps the most shocking. Did you know that on a typical galleon carrying around 200 people, there were only 12 to 15 proper sleeping places? But here's the detail history books rarely mention. Those spots were reserved exclusively for the captain, high-ranking officers, and noble passengers. And the rest? The other 185 sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, and exiles slept wherever they could. On the deck if there was space, between the cannons if they weren't in use, in the cargo holds, fighting for space with rats, cockroaches, and the cargo itself. But wait, the situation was even worse than it sounds. During storms which could last for days, everyone was forced below deck. Imagine 200 people crammed into a space smaller than your house, with no proper ventilation, no light, and violently tossing back and forth for days on end. A report by Pero Vaz de Caminha, not the one who wrote the discovery letter but another sailor with the same name, described a 5-day storm in 1534. Men vomited on one another, for there was no room to move. The stench was such that many preferred to risk staying on deck, even with waves crashing over the vessel. Can you imagine that? Can you truly picture yourself in that situation? But let's talk about what really mattered for survival. Water. Ah, the water. That deserves its own chapter in this maritime horror story. Galleons departed with vast reserves of fresh water, stored in wooden barrels. It seemed like enough, right? The problem was that this water began to rot within the first week at sea. And when I say rot, I don't mean it tasted bad. I mean it turned into a green, viscous soup filled with larvae, worms, and an astonishing amount of microorganisms, making every sip a biological game of Russian roulette. Friar Vicente do Salvador, in his 1567 writings, described, "By the end of the first month, the water was so foul that one had to pinch their nose to drink it. Many chose to mix it with wine to mask the flavor of decay." But here's what will truly shock you. That rotten water was often the only option available. And do you know what the Portuguese crown's official solution was to this problem? Cut the daily water ration in half after the first month, you read that right. The solution to contaminated water was drink less of it. The result? Many sailors didn't die of thirst, but from dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases. The more experienced developed questionable techniques. Some filtered water through dirty cloths, others let it settle so the worst things would sink to the bottom. If water was a problem, imagine the food. The basic diet aboard consisted of sea biscuits, a mix of flour and water baked until they were hard as stone. These biscuits were designed to last for months without spoiling, and they did. The problem is, so did the bugs that infested them. An anonymous chronicler from a 1542 voyage wrote, "You had to bang the biscuits against the wood before eating, so the worms would fall out. Some sailors did it in the dark, preferring not to." See what they were eating. Salted meat wasn't much better. Imagine pork or beef cut into chunks, covered in absurd amounts of salt, and left to cure for weeks even before boarding. The result was something with the texture of wet leather, and a saltiness so intense it caused more thirst than it satisfied hunger. But the worst was yet to come. After a few weeks at sea, even this horrible food began to run out. Rations were gradually reduced, first from 3 meals to 2, then from 2 to 1. In the most extreme cases, the daily ration was reduced to a handful of moldy biscuits and a sip of rotten water. And when the official food ran out, well, that's when the story gets truly dark. Have you ever wondered why so many Galleon voyage records mention deaths from diseases, but rarely specify what kind? I wondered too, until I discovered unofficial reports, personal letters, and confessions that survived hidden away in forgotten archives. The truth is that when the food ran out, some things happened that official chroniclers preferred not to document. There are whispered accounts of crews resorting to practices that challenge our modern understanding of civilization. Father Antonio Vieira, in a private letter from 1641, mentions, "I saw things on this voyage that I dare not write down, for anyone who read them would not believe that Christian men could sink to such a state." What exactly did he see? The official records don't say, but there are clues in fragmented documents, indirect accounts, and confessions made decades later by survivors who carried unbearable secrets. One such fragment, found in the archives, of the Torre do Tombo speaks of a 1578 voyage where men lost all humanity when hunger became unbearable. The document is damaged, but the remaining words paint a terrible picture of what happened when human beings were pushed to the absolute limits of survival. But there was something worse than hunger, worse than thirst, even worse than the storms that could break a galleon in half. It was something invisible, silent, attacking when people were most vulnerable. Scurvy. You've probably heard of this disease, the lack of vitamin C that plagued sailors. But do you really understand what it meant to die of scurvy at sea? It started subtly. Extra fatigue, some joint pain. Then the gums began to swell and bleed. Sailors lost their teeth one by one. The skin turned pale, then yellowish, then developed purple spots spreading like a map of death. But the worst came after. Old wounds reopened. Scars from years ago started bleeding as if fresh. The body literally began to rot from within. A ship, surgeon Garcia de Orta described in 1563. "I saw men who seemed to be falling apart before my eyes. Death came slowly, like a prolonged torture lasting weeks. And the scariest part? No one knew what caused it. There was no known cure. Some captains tried bizarre remedies, forcing the sick to eat rotten wood, drink urine mixed with gunpowder, chew rawhide. Imagine being in the middle of the ocean, watching your comrades waste away from a mysterious disease, knowing you might be next, and being powerless to stop it. With conditions so extreme, you might think mutinies were common. And you'd be right. But here's another dark secret. Most mutinies were never officially recorded. Why? Because admitting a mutiny meant admitting failures in command, discipline, and the very structure of the Portuguese Empire. It was easier to record deaths by disease or losses in storms than to explain why half the crew rebelled against the captain. But in private archives, personal letters, and confessions, the real story emerges. Entire crews refusing to continue sailing. Officers found dead under mysterious circumstances. Captains who simply disappeared during the night. One particularly disturbing document, found among the personal papers of D. João de Castro, mentions a 1552 voyage where extreme measures had to be taken to maintain order. What measures were those? The document does not specify, but it mentions that 16 men were lost during a single stormy night. 16 men lost in one night, on a ship that, according to the records, didn't face any storm during that period, 3 months at sea, 90 days surrounded by the same faces, the same smells, the same horrors. Have you ever considered what that does to the human mind? Medical records from the time rarely mention mental health issues. Understanding of human psychology was practically non-existent. But there are descriptions of behaviors that today we would clearly recognize as psychotic breaks, severe depression, and other mental disorders. Some men began talking to people who weren't there, writes an anonymous chronicler from 1589. Others refused to speak at all, remaining mute for weeks until madness completely consumed them. There were also those who developed dangerous obsessions, sailors who became convinced that certain shipmates were responsible for all the voyage's misfortunes. Others who started to believe the ship was cursed, trying to pierce the hull to release trapped souls. Isolation, combined with constant stress, poor nutrition, and lack of proper sleep, created a perfect cocktail for mental collapse. And once madness took hold, it spread like an invisible epidemic throughout the crew. Here we arrive at the darkest aspect of this whole story. What happened when someone died on board? Official records are almost poetic in their simplicity. He was committed to the sea with all Christian honors. The reality was very different. First, there was the practical issue. What to do with the body? In tropical waters, decomposition started within hours. The smell quickly became unbearable in the confined space. The obvious solution was to throw the body overboard as quickly as possible. But what if the person was still alive, just unconscious? Documents suggest this was a real concern. Some captains developed tests to determine if someone was truly dead, methods we would now consider primitive and barbaric. And then there was the matter of belongings. Technically, a dead sailor's possessions were supposed to be kept to be delivered to the family. In practice, everything was divided among the survivors the moment the body touched the water. But the most disturbing were the suspicious deaths. How many sailors really died of diseases, and how many were eliminated by desperate shipmates? Some documents suggest that when food became scarce, the weakest and sickest, well, let's leave that to the imagination. Imagine that, against all odds, you survived. 3 months later, the Galleon finally sights land. You survived hunger, thirst, disease, madness, silent mutinies, and dark secrets never recorded. But here's the final irony. Many who survived the voyage died just days after reaching their destination. Why? Their bodies, devastated by months of deprivation, simply couldn't handle the sudden change in diet, the tropical diseases, the shock of returning to civilization. There are records of entire crews arriving only to be decimated by local diseases within weeks. It was as if the sea demanded its toll one way or another. So why were these stories buried? Why do history books tell us about the glories of discovery but omit these horrible details? The answer is simple. No one wanted to admit that the price of global exploration was paid with nearly unimaginable suffering. It was easier to tell stories of brave heroes conquering the seas than to admit thousands of men died in conditions that would make a concentration camp look luxurious. But the documents are there, hidden in dusty archives, waiting for someone. Who cares to seek the truth behind the glory? So returning to the original question, do you really believe you would survive 3 months on a galleon? I'm not talking about the romanticized version from pirate movies. I'm talking about the brutal reality I found in historical documents. I'm talking about rotten water you'd have to drink to avoid dying of thirst. I'm talking about worm-infested food you'd have to swallow to avoid starving. I'm talking about mysterious diseases that literally made your body fall apart. I'm talking about 3 months of floating hell, surrounded by people who gradually lost their humanity. And even if you survived all of that, even if your body held up, even if your mind didn't succumb to madness, would you still be the same person when you reached your destination? The few first-hand accounts that survived suggest not. That the men who returned from these voyages were fundamentally different from those who set out. They carried secrets, traumas, and memories they couldn't share with anyone who hadn't lived through the same hell. Maybe that's why so few detailed records survived. Maybe some secrets are too heavy to be carried through the centuries. But now you know. Now you have a small glimpse of what it really meant to sail the seas in the 16th century. And maybe, just maybe, you understand why I say with such certainty that you wouldn't survive a 3-month voyage on a galleon. The question remains, after knowing all this, do you still romanticize the age of discovery the same way? Or now, when you look at a world map, can you see the stains of blood along the trade routes? History is much darker than we were told, and maybe it's time we face that truth.